national origin makes them suspect. Now, Worth never gets around to explaining the criteria whereby he established which nations are ipso facto suspect. But the fact that he included Ireland and Poland on the list indicates that it wasn't just countries at war with the United States. In fact, the only thing which the Irish and the Polish, who viewed each other generally as members of mutually alien races at the time, the only thing they had in common other than American citizenship was the fact that they were Catholic. It was a commonality which existed only in the eyes of the people who considered them a threat, certainly not in the minds of the Polish and the Irish themselves. The tension between the Polish laity and their priest and a largely uncomprehending Irish hierarchy in the American Catholic Church was so intense that it was the driving force behind the formation of the schismatic Polish National Church. The theory of the triple melting pot states that religion supersedes country of origin as the source of ethnicity in the United States after the third generation. If so, then Catholics in America had no ethnic identity at the time Worth was writing about them. The only identity they had was in the eyes of the class which perceived them as a threat. The Catholic ethnics were particularly vulnerable in this regard. They were regarded as a group by the people who wanted to attack them, but they couldn't look beyond the bounds of national origin to prepare a pan-Catholic defense, assuming they were even aware of what was going on at the time. Since psychological warfare demanded stealth to ensure its effectiveness, it was clear that they weren't going to find out what was going on for a long time. Certainly not when the war was going on and the normal channels of communication had been shut down in the name of national security. So at the same time that the German ethnics were being called upon to assert their patriotism and fight in a European war, often as in the case of Italy and Germany, against their countries of origin, the psychological warfare establishment had targeted them as a fifth column, and therefore fair game for the panoply of whatever black operations the intelligence community thought they deserved. What we have here, I have to say at this point, is a complete violation of any notion of citizenship here. It's clear that there are certain citizens who are not citizens. And it's clear that there are certain citizens who have the right to interfere in their lives surreptitiously with the government, full government support. Since Myrdal's book, The American Dilemma, originated at the instigation of the Carnegie Corporation, and since it ended up in the hands of Louis Wirth and Samuel Stouffer, it was probably a project of the psychological warfare establishment from its inception. Simpson, I'm talking about the book here, The Science of Coercion, makes clear that the arsenal of the psychological warfare establishment included black operations, i.e., quote, the clandestine targeting of the U.S. population in addition to that of foreign countries for psychological operations. What Simpson doesn't specify is which groups got targeted, but that gap can be filled largely by investigating Louis Wirth's wartime activities. Now, who was Louis Wirth? Louis Wirth was born in Gmunden, a town near Koblenz in Germany, on August 28, 1897, to a family of Jewish cattle merchants who had lived in the area, in fact, in the same house for 4 centuries. Wirth, the adult sociologist, would later to go on to scorn Gmunden as the paradigmatic example of a narrow, provincial, small town. There is some indication that he felt the same way while growing up, because when a relative who had emigrated to the United States offered to bring Wirth over to further his education, Wirth leapt at the chance. After excelling in the public school system in Omaha, Nebraska, Wirth won a scholarship to the University of Chicago, where he quickly became politically engaged by joining the many Marxist student organizations which were active on campus during World War I. Wirth's daughter claims that his attachment to Marxism, quote, seems never to have been very deep. This is in the introduction to his collected works. But then she conveniently leaves out the references to Stalin and Lenin in his mature writings, which would contradict that statement. Like many Jews of his generation, Wirth assimilated with an alacrity which must have caused consternation to his relatives in Germany. In 1923, he married Mary Bolton, a Baptist from Kentucky who had gone to the University of Chicago, which had been founded by another Baptist, John D. Rockefeller. In marrying her, Wirth's daughter writes, Wirth was the first member of his family to marry a non-Jew. Wirth's assimilationist inclinations and principles, like those of his wife, partly derived from their common reaction against dogmatism and provincial ethnocentrism. Their two daughters were to be encouraged in agnosticism with audible atheistic overtones. At the time, they were to acquire a generalized minority ethnic identification. That's from Louis Wirth on Cities and Social Life, the daughter's introduction to the book. Given his Marxist politics, his repudiation of traditional religious belief, and his assimilationist attitude toward ethnicity, it is not surprising that Wirth would be drawn to the internationalist cause during the days preceding World War II. Like his New York counterpart, Robert Moses, also a Jew, Wirth saw ethnicity as retrograde and something which was to be replaced by faith in things rational and enlightened. The irony, of course, is that in espousing the Enlightenment, Wirth was also espousing the views of the dominant ethnic group in the United States at that time. In assimilating, he did pretty much the same thing, not repudiating ethnicity, but rather exchanging one ethnicity for another. By doing what he did, Wirth endowed ethnicity with a certain instrumental value. It was, as Lenin and Stalin believed, subordinate to class. In this instance, the American ruling class, which had its own ethnically homogeneous nature at the time. Unlike the nativists and people like Henry Ford, the East Coast WASP elite was perfectly willing to adopt Jews into their class if the adoptee was willing to espouse the same Enlightenment philosophy they espoused. That meant espousing Stalin's policy of ethnic cleansing. Wirth, like Samuel Stouffer, a University of Chicago sociologist, and as such another member of the psychological warfare establishment, Wirth was a seminal thinker for the OSS and the OWI during the war. It was in the Office of Strategic Services and the Office of War Information. And it was in this capacity that he came up with the policy that would eventually inform the two crucial Supreme Court decisions ratifying social engineering in 1954, Berman versus Parker, which was about housing, and Brown versus School Board, which was the school desegregation decision. The policy he proposed would come to be known as integration, but in reality, the policy he articulated was what Lenin and Stalin would have called the Soviet solution to the nationalities question. If the continuing existence of ethnic enclaves constituted bad news from Wirth's point of view, there was good news too. And as usual, in moments like this, Wirth adverts to the future in general and to the future of social engineering in particular. If, he writes, science has demonstrated anything, it has shown conclusively that these traits are subject to human intervention and they can be changed. The possibility of the ultimate assimilability of ethnic groups is thus beyond doubt. But even if this is true, that's a close quote, even if this is true, Americans still need models to show how it is to be done, and it is coming up with the models for solving our nationalities problem that Wirth is forced to show his political hand. Again, this is the document that I mentioned. It's in the Wirth papers in the University of Chicago, but his daughter did not include it in the collected writings. And once you hear it, I think you'll see why. In recent years, Louis Wirth writes, the Russian experiment is regarded by many as not only at least as enlightened as our own, but as much more relevant to the minority problems of Europe and the backward nations of the world. It is generally agreed among students of the problem that the Soviet nationalities and minorities policy represents one of the most outstanding achievements of the revolution and the period of Reconstruction, and that it holds great promise for the settlement of minority problems in the coming peace. The Soviet government under Lenin's leadership and with Stalin as commissar for the nationalities proceeded immediately after the Bolshevik Revolution to inaugurate a policy which accords with the best scientific knowledge and the most enlightened moral principles. I guess that's why she dropped it out of the book. And what did Wirth have in mind when he praised Stalin's handling of the nationalities question in the mid-1940s? The answer depends on which Stalin Wirth is talking about. If it's the Stalin of the early period, in other words, Stalin's writings, Wirth is talking about assimilation. In other words, people will identify class as their group description, and they will, once they identify with class, they will abandon ethnicity. That happened in the United States under Wirth's direction. The only difference was that it was the different class. It wasn't the working class or the proletariat, it was the middle class. And the engine for creating middle-class people was to become the suburbs. You left an ethnic neighborhood, you left your ethnic identity behind in the neighborhood, and when you moved to the suburbs, you became a generic American white guy. If Wirth is talking about Stalin's deeds in the mid-1940s, which is when he wrote that document, he's talking about something more sinister. He is talking about ethnic cleansing. According to Pohl, the author of the book on Stalin's career as an ethnic cleanser, Stalin's regime, this is the regime which Wirth proposes as the model for solving America's nationalities problem, quote, pursued ethnic cleansing as a part of its overall security policy. That began in 1937 when Stalin deported Soviet Koreans to Central Asia. In 1941, he deported the Volga Germans to Siberia. My daughter-in-law her grandmother was Volga Deutsch, and she grew up in Siberia. Her grandmother ended up in Siberia as a result of this deportation policy. And in 1943, he deported the Kalmyks from their home just west of Astrakhan to Kazakhstan. The 1937 deportation of the Koreans had become secret, but the deportation of the Volga Deutsch and the Kalmyks were announced in official Soviet ukases when their ethnic Soviet republics were abolished by Stalin. Since Wirth was working as one of the leading theoreticians of our military intelligence establishment at the time, it is unlikely that he was unaware of what was going on. Wirth would eventually write at least 8 chapters of The American Dilemma, while at the same time writing reports for the OSS and the OWI. In addition to spying on the ethnic population of Chicago, which is where it was based, Wirth also wrote up a report for the OWI on the famous race riot of Detroit in 1943, a report which dovetails completely with the promotion of social engineering on racial matters which suffused the American dilemma. Our position, now this letter is Clyde Hart, written by Clyde Hart, Wirth's boss at the OWI, in response to a letter that Wirth wrote. Again, Clyde Hart responding to Wirth's letter. Our position has been that the race problem is not one to be dealt with in the main by informational programs. It requires rather direct, sensible readjustments of the kind you suggest in housing, recreation, and health facilities